Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm Mallory Murphy.
And I'm Katie Burke.
And we're sitting in for Mike and Chris today. If you love duck calling and you love history, then you're going to really enjoy our next guest.
Mike Lewis is an author, a collector of Arkansas duck calls, and the current chairman of the board of the Call Makers and Collectors Association of America. How are you today, Mike?
Doing fine.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first, thanks for having me. I'm 56 years old, I'm a lifelong Arkansas resident from a little small town called Whitehall, which is about 40 minutes south of Little Rock. Grew up as a duck hunter, hunted my entire life, and just kind of fell into collecting duck calls almost as an accident, the way a lot of people do. You, as a duck hunter, you will get one call, and then you'll be searching for that holy grail of another call. And you'll buy another call, and before you realize it, you've got a handful of calls. And then some of us take that handful of calls onto kind of the obsession level where we wind up with a whole lot more than a handful of calls. And that's kind of what I did.
You graduated with a master's in history and historic preservation from Wake Forest. How has that informed your interest in call collecting and call making history in Arkansas?
Well, I think for me personally, it had a huge effect because I always had this, from being a small kid, I've always had the interest in history. And then when I went further with the preservation of artifacts and just museum education and the like, I didn't pursue that because at the time there really weren't many jobs available. So I worked for a few years and then went to law school, and that's a path I wound up taking. But I always had that kind of interest in history. And, some people are collectors and some people aren't. I grew up in a family, my mom and dad didn't collect anything. I mean, it just, they did not acquire things for the sake of owning them. And I mean, even as a kid, I was a baseball card collecting fool, and I always liked gathering objects. And some people do, some people don't. I'm not sure exactly how I got that gene and where I got it from, but academic studies obviously impacted my interest in preserving duck calls. And I mean, for me, I've got somewhere around 2,000 duck calls, which is just a stupid amount. I mean, it is just it's just crazy. The majority of them are on display in my house. And, I don't keep them locked in a safe. I have them out on display, kind of like they are in the museum at the DU Waterfowl Heritage Center. They're all out, and I look at them every day, and it's just... For me, I wouldn't have a collection like that if I kept it locked up. I have it out to enjoy it, and I like showing it to people, and I like talking to other collectors about it, and I like it when people come over to my house and they see these shells filled with these little pieces of wood, and they're like, what the heck is this? And so I like telling them about it.
Your book, Call in the Wild, is about the history of Arkansas duck calls. Tell us how you went from a call collector to an author.
Probably in the late 1990s, I had hunted, like I said, my entire life. And I actually saw an old Alvin Taylor duck call in an antique store. And I looked at it and thought, that's really cool. And, it's a call that I knew from when I was a kid. And I picked it up. I paid $100 for it, which at the time seemed like an exorbitant amount, but it was a really nice call made out of corian, which is a kitchen countertop material. And so it was kind of unique. Took it, was really proud of it, and showed it to my wife. And she's like, you paid $100 for that? And it kind of went from there to where I started scouring antique malls and, various places. eBay was a good spot early on where you could find a lot of collectible duck calls and just really all kinds of stuff hunting related. And I just became interested in the history behind duck calls, when they were invented, who made them, what kind of people made them, obviously growing up, you had to learn to use a duck call in Arkansas. I mean, it was almost a requirement, especially if you hunted in the places where I hunted. And so essentially from that, I started just buying any old duck call that I could find, and eventually realized that, you just can't collect everything. So I started focusing on just Arkansas-made duck calls because we have such a wonderful tradition of duck call making in Arkansas. Some of the most famous makers, some of the most artistic makers, some of the best sounding duck calls ever. As I just collected more and more and focused more and more on Arkansas calls, I realized that that link to the early call making history was fading away, and that every year it seemed like, as I collected from the late 90s on, it seemed like we lost more and more older call makers, or we lost a link to someone that was a call maker around the turn of the 19th century, someone that knew that call maker that may have died in the 1940s or 1950s. You wouldn't have any more information ever about that call maker. And so probably around 2010, I started actively researching and trying to formulate like research files about call makers and their history, what they did, when they did it, how they made the calls, kind of where their place in history was. And I kind of had a vague idea of writing a book, but mainly I just wanted to preserve and document that history. The more I gathered, the more I decided I really needed to write it down and to ultimately share it with other people. And that's essentially kind of where Calling the Wild started.
Some of these calls are considered folk art. Why do you think it's so important to preserve and tell the stories of these pieces of wood that folks make to lure in ducks?
I think it's just a part of our American heritage. It's a uniquely American art form. I mean, it's kind of like decoy making. I think decoy making in the United States is a slice of Americana. Duck call making is the same way. I mean, there's obviously no benefit to calling a duck if your duck call has carved ducks or a carved rattlesnake on it, or if it's checkered in a certain way, or if it's designed to where it's stylish. And to me, that's what is one of the most fascinating things about early call makers. You need just a smooth piece of wood and some instrument. You've got your barrel, and you need that as the instrument to hold the reed to make the sound. And there was never any reason to make it stylish. I mean, it's a utilitarian object to call a duck, and no need for it to look stunningly beautiful. Yet you had these people that had no artistic training, generally were not wealthy people, didn't have a lot of leisure time on their hands. They were working for a living and sometimes just barely scraping by, but they put that little added extra flair to what they did in order to make it not just functional, but beautiful too.
Every collector has their own particular interest, but what about these calls intrigue you?
My collecting has kind of taken a little bit of a strange path, because when I decided I wanted to write my book, I wanted to get a call from every person that I could find out ever made a call in Arkansas. And so that went from the big names like Ed St. Mary and J.T. Beckhart and Pop Pickle and John Jolly and people like that are famous and that's calls are extremely expensive, all the way down to some farmer in Harrisburg, Arkansas that made 25 calls in the 1930s. So for me, I would get excited when I found that really rare unknown call. And it might not be as historically significant, but it would be so rare and so difficult to find that I would really get excited about a lesser call, but because it was rare and it kind of fit into the scheme of what I was trying to accomplish as far as a comprehensive collection of Arkansas duck calls.
All right, Mike, let's talk about some of the most notable call makers from Arkansas. How about you talk about a few of your favorites?
Yeah, it's kind of like picking your favorite kid. It's really tough to do, you know. I mean, Arkansas truly has some of the most significant, most artistically beautiful, just stylish duck calls ever made. Some of my favorites would be by the father of Arkansas duck calls, J.T. Beckhart. Beckhart was a market hunter, lived in northeast Arkansas in the Big Lake area, and made just some fantastic calls, checkered, carved, and just really stunningly beautiful works of art. Ira Green Ferguson from down in South Arkansas near Hamburg made another beautiful, really stylish call. G.D. Kenny, who lived in Memphis but also was the caretaker at the Five Oaks Club in Hughes, Arkansas, made a beautiful duck call. We fight over John Jolly, who was born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, lived in Pine Bluff for a while, and then moved to West Memphis, ultimately Memphis, and then moved back to Arkansas. Between the Arkansas makers and the Tennessee makers, we fight over John Jolly and we fight over G.D. Kenny. And, Memphis and obviously its proximity to Arkansas, I think we can share.
It's hard to believe that the Arkansas style call wasn't around forever. It came about right around the turn of the century. Nowadays, it's the standard design for duck calls. What inspired makers to create this new type of call?
Well, your first duck calls were, if you're familiar with the tongue pincher style of call, that was probably the first duck call ever made. And it was more of a squawker and didn't really sound like what we consider a duck call to sound like today. The early makers in Illinois developed different styles of making a call. And then, of course, around Reelfoot Lake, you had the Reelfoot Lake style call, which essentially we use to refer to a call that has a separate wooden wedge block, a metal reed, and then that goes in a friction fit into the barrel to hold the reed in place. The Arkansas style, as you've said, it's a one-piece stopper, but it has a cork wedge and a reed that fits onto the tone board. It's obviously a much simpler construction and much more stable. It's you take apart a Reelfoot style call in a blind and you're very likely to lose either your reed or your wedge block, and then it's useless. In an Arkansas style call, it'll all stay together, obviously, and which is easier to use. And kind of that developed more of what we consider the modern sound with either initially a hard rubber reed or now almost exclusively Mylar, and just a simpler way to skin that cat, basically.
Do you sell any of the calls in your collection or keep them for yourself? Like, do you dabble in any of the trading?
Well, for a long time, I was kind of the black hole of collecting. And it just, I bought and I never sold. But interestingly enough, when I put these calls on display at the DU Museum, it kind of made me reassess, because I had all these gaps where I took all these calls down, and it kind of made me reassess what I had collected. And so I've actually traded some and sold a few recently, but I haven't sold many.
Do you ever blow any of the calls from your collection?
Yeah. Do you take any of these prized possessions hunting with you?
I've not taken any of like the Beckharts and the Ira Green Ferguson calls, but 2 years ago I hunted with a ham bone call made by Howard Amadon, probably in the 1960s. And it's really not, it's from that era, you didn't get the volume from the call that you get with today's call. So it's a softer, more mellow tone, but it was effective and it was fun and it was great to hunt with it. The ham bone I took just because I had one that just sounded just so sweet. It just had just this really good mellow tone and sounded great. And plus it wasn't just, it wasn't like it was a $5,000 duck call. So if I happened to lose it, it wouldn't have been the end of the world.
Do you have a favorite call just in general?
My favorite calls for contemporary makers were made by Billy Ray Starks. And Billy and I became friends back in the early 2000s. Billy made the Rebel duck call, and his calls won, I think, 2 world championships and 2 junior world championships and multiple state and regional championships. And I met Billy back in the early 2000s just from calling him up and asking if he had any calls for sale. And so I bought one call from him. I really liked it. And then I bought some more, and then I bought some more. And eventually he and I became friends, and I spent hours in his shop. And I had decided, I'm buying all these duck calls and collecting all these calls, and I'll learn how to make a call myself. Well, back 15 years ago, it's really, it was almost pre-internet explosion. And so you had these call makers that learned how to make calls either totally on their own or were mentored by some old-time call maker. And they weren't nearly as free to share information. They learned it the hard way, so they wanted you to either learn it the hard way or you weren't going to learn it at all. Now you can just go to the internet and Google how to make a duck call, and you get these tutorials and show you step by step how to do it. But somebody like Billy Starks that started in the late 60s, he just figured out how to do it on his own, which is, in my opinion, pretty amazing. But as he and I became friends, I'd spend time in his shop and I'd watch him make duck calls. But when it came to the important part, making the insert, the thing that makes the noise, he'd always shoo me out of the shop. He wouldn't, but I kept going, and I kept hanging out with him, and we'd have lunch, and, we got to be friends. And eventually he started giving me pointers. And I can remember the first duck call that I ever turned was just a horrible looking piece of wood. And it sounded like a kazoo, but I got it to quack. And I jumped in my car and I drove down to Stuttgart, and I was so proud, and I took it to Billy and I said, look, I got one. He blew it and just kind of hung his head and shook it and said, come on in the shop. And he took it in the shop and he took the insert out and he got a file and he started filing on the tone board and blew it a couple times. And all of a sudden it sounded more like a real duck. And so he could tell then that I was kind of serious about learning how to actually make a call. And so over the next 8 or 10 years, he'd give me pointers here or there. And he was just a great source of teaching someone to do something. And it was really kind of a unique situation. He taught a few people how to make calls over the years, but it was never, with those old-time makers, it was never information that was freely shared. Mm-hmm. So it's just a different era.
All right, Mike, I've got to ask, what is your holy grail call? What is the one call that keeps you awake at night saying, I need to add this to my collection of 2,000 duck calls?
For me, without doubt, it would be one of the calls that J.T. Beckhart made that is pictured on the cover of my book. It's a carved call, and it's got, I think, an alligator, a shotgun. I can't remember what else on it. It's got a carved rattlesnake going around the stopper. And the story is that Beckhart had 3 granddaughters, and he made a call for each of the 3 grandchildren. One is owned by the Jay Cucci collection, which is just a phenomenal collection of calls. Jay passed away, I think it's probably 5 or 6 years ago now, and has just a phenomenal collection. He bought one of the calls, and a fellow by the name of Lynn Goldman that lives in Aurora, Colorado, outside of Denver, has another one. So 2 of the 3 calls, and they're all 3 are purportedly made the same way with the same carvings and the same snake going around the stopper. 2 of the calls are in collections, and we know where they are. And the 3rd one's still floating around somewhere. And I just have this vision that it's in somebody's drawer at a house, and it's just sitting there, and they have no idea what they've got. And it would be the pinnacle. And it holds the distinction of being the highest price call ever sold at auction, and it sold for a little bit over $100,000. Oh, yeah. And I actually had a collector 3 or 4 years ago that told me that he had a lead on the 3rd one and that he was going to look at it. And of course, I told him, if you find it, I would pay you a stupid amount of money for it. Yeah. And I talked to him later, and he said he did go out somewhere in the boondocks thought he was going to get robbed before he could look at the call. But once he looked at the call, he realized that it was just a replica.
Where do you think the future of call collecting is headed?
I think it's equally bright. And one of the things that I think is a distinguishing characteristic between call collecting and decoy collecting is that the absolute numbers of decoys to collect, that availability is much greater than it is for duck calls. Because, if you go hunting, you might carry 24 decoys, 100 decoys, but you're only going to have one call. In the old days, one call. Today, maybe two, maybe three. So it's a lot smaller volume of things that you can collect. And I think as far as collecting, there's a strong interest in duck calls. It's we haven't reached the level of prices that decoys have reached. I mean, it's routine for a decoy to sell for six figures or more. And, it's only happened once in the history of duck calls. But we have a strong core group of collectors. And one of the things that's interesting about call collecting is that because they're so rare and so difficult to get, collectors tend to hang on to them forever. And, like if I'm going to trade or sell a call, it's virtually never going to be an old call, a valuable collectible call. It would be something that I consider more contemporary. So what we have in call collecting, we have several members that of the call collecting community that have wonderful collections. I mean, worth huge sums of money that are older. And so I think at some point, some of those collections will come onto the market the way it has in decoy collecting. I mean, when you look at Guyette and Dieter auctions and Copley auctions, it seems like they are constantly cycling through the collection of so-and-so or such and such. And those are people that started collecting decoys, say, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and they've either passed away or they've reached an age where they want to divest themselves of some of their collection. And so I think that if that happens in call collecting, I think it would be beneficial because it's difficult for a younger person to get these really old vintage calls because there's just so few of them. And the prices sometimes make it prohibitive for someone that's younger to collect them. And so I think it'd be good if we had more of the great old calls to come onto the market to give people a chance to kind of get into the hobby.
On the flip side of that, there are a lot of calls that are lower priced, whereas decoys, there are not. There's, a big discrepancy in that. In the future, do you see those lower priced calls rising in the same way that decoys have?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I can tell you that, like I told you at the start about the Alvin Taylor call that I bought that kind of sparked my interest in truly thinking of collecting duck calls versus being a duck hunter that just kind of acquired some by mistake. I bought that call in 2000 or 99 whenever I bought it, and I paid $100 for it, and it's probably a $1,500 call now. So what you have now, you have just a wonderful group of contemporary call makers that do some of the best checkering, some of the best carving that you could ever imagine. And you can collect those calls, and a lot of people collect more of the contemporary stuff. And for me, what I consider to be contemporary, that's stuff from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But, that was 20 years ago contemporary calls. So 20 years in the future, some of these guys that are making these really cool calls now, they'll be super collectible, and they're collectible now. I think that's what happens with a lot of collectibles like that is you collect what you grew up with. Right. And, like me, I grew up with chick majors, ham bone, calls like that. But I developed an interest in the older stuff. But a lot of people will focus on the calls that they grew up with.
With the modern call makers and what you see going through the competitions, you see a lot more decorative calls than you do see functional ones. Why do you think that is, Mike?
the Call Makers and Collectors Association, we sponsored multiple calling contests, and there's one that is in conjunction with what used to be called the Midwest Decoy Association. Now I think it's the National Decoy Association. For years it was outside, and still is outside of Chicago. And we sponsor one contest there that is decorative. And it's purely, it needs to quack and sound moderately like a duck, but it is focused upon carving, checkering, artistic design. We have another contest at Reelfoot Lake in October that is based on sound. We sponsor and participate in the National Wild Turkey Federation calling contest in Nashville in February, and that is a blend of craftsmanship, workmanship, and sound, and it's judged based on these categories. What I find is that some of the best contemporary makers as far as sound also now apply as much of their artistic abilities towards making a beautiful, cool-looking duck call as they do to making it sound great. And so it's not, I guess to some extent, it is still kind of rare to have a call that is artistically beautiful and, perfect carving, beautiful checkering, and sounds wonderful also, but it's not as rare as it was in the old days. Because we have, it's another golden age of duck calls. There are truly some fantastic call makers alive today.
If some of our listeners wanted to get into call collecting, how do you think they would get started?
Probably the first way to do it would be to join the Call Makers and Collectors Association of America. It's a nonprofit organization, and it's comprised of call collectors and call makers. So you have contemporary call makers that are members, and then you have people that collect contemporary calls and people that collect vintage calls and people that are interested in history. It's a good way to meet other collectors, to learn about the hobby. We publish a quarterly newsletter, and we have call-making competitions based on both appearance and sound, and we have annual and more frequent get-togethers where you can swap calls, trade calls, buy calls, or sell calls. We're really the only organization that focuses on call collecting. But other than that, I think you just you can obviously buy books like Calling the Wild, and there are other books. Howard Harlan's written 2 books on the history of duck calls. Bob Christensen wrote a book on the history of Illinois duck calls. Darren Fontenot wrote a book about Louisiana calls. And so you can buy those books, and you can kind of see what's out there and see how to identify and to possibly guide you in the way that you collect. And there are just a myriad of ways to collect. You can do like what I did, which was focus just on one state. I know some people that focus just on one era. They don't collect any calls that were made after 1950. I know some people that collect only what are called water label calls. And that's a specific kind of label that was used in the 40s and the 50s. And it was a water transfer label. So we call them water labels. And they're a really specific time frame, and you can build just an incredible collection by just focusing narrowly or as widely as you want.
Say I'm a rookie call collector. I'm 28 years old. I've got a little bit of money in my pocket, but I got to pay my bills. What are some current call makers that are likely to be future legends that I can start looking into and possibly start buying their calls?
That's a great question. Recently, Butch Rickenbach died several years ago. You have ready availability of rich and tone calls. Billy Starks died in January of this year. Billy never had the volume of calls made that Butch did, but his calls are out there, and they are extremely collectible. Rick Dunn, and I've named 3 Arkansas guys. Rick Dunn still, Rick's not hand-making calls anymore, but you can still find handmade calls. Those are 3 guys that are kind of from that generation that started making calls in the 60s, 70s, and on. As far as contemporary makers, Brad Samples makes a wonderful call, just wins consistently at the NWTF competition. Ronnie Turner makes a fine duck call. Brad's from South Carolina. Ronnie's from Tennessee, Collierville, I think, near here. John Kep from Missouri makes a fantastic call. Brian Byers from Illinois. Troy Taylor from near Seattle makes a fantastic call. There truly are there are literally a dozen more guys that I could name that make a really good sounding call. And in all honesty, it's easier to make a really good sounding call now than it was 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, just because the tooling's better and the knowledge is easier to acquire. Josh Raggio, that's another one that makes a fantastic call. Yeah, Josh really does. And a fantastic guy and makes a great duck call.
Is there a certain type of wood that call collectors seek more than others?
Not really. Most of your early calls were made from either cedar, because it was readily available and it's easy to carve and it's easy to fashion. Walnut, again, readily available. And then bodock, which depending on where you live, you can call it hedge, bodock, bodiarc, horse apple. It's got a million different names, but it was a wood of choice for many call makers. And those are kind of the three that if you find an old call, that's probably what it's going to be made out of. Occasionally you would find some call maker that would use mahogany, but that was considered more of an exotic wood.
Now they can make them out of anything. If you can turn on a lathe, you can make a duck call out of it.
Yeah.
Where can we find your book, Mike?
It's listed on Amazon. It's for sale at Max Prairie Wings and at the Rich and Tone Duck Call Shop in Stuttgart. It's available in some bookstores in Little Rock, but I haven't decided whether to reprint it or not, and I'm down to just a very few copies.
Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I might start having me a little collection.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Special thanks to our guest today, Mike Lewis. Thanks again to my co-host, Katie Burke, for talking calls with us today, and to our producer, Clay Baird, for keeping us on track. As always, thanks to all of you for tuning in and for supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.